My name is Arvin Clay, and I turned 82 this spring. Though most mornings I still wake with the vague astonishment of a man who somehow slipped past his own ending. The house I live in, or lived in, before everything unraveled, used to belong to my son and his wife. But lately I have felt more like an uninvited guest than family. It sits on the outskirts of Springfield, Missouri, a one-story ranch house that smells of furniture polish and silence. My daughter-in-law keeps the place immaculate, though she often reminds me how hard it is to maintain order when there are old people's things lying around. By that, she means my newspaper piles, my coffee mugs, my army photographs, objects that to me are fragments of life, but to her are clutter. I do not argue any more. I simply fold the paper neatly, set my mug on the coaster, and remind myself that peace sometimes costs pride. Every morning, I wake early out of habit, long before anyone else, and make the first pot of coffee. My late wife, Lorraine, used to say that coffee was the only prayer I ever kept faithful to. She has been gone 12 years, taken by lung cancer that came without mercy or pause. I still speak to her quietly when I stand by the window watching dawn crawl across the fields. It's not madness, it's survival. I tell her what day it is, what aches more than yesterday, what I dreamed of. Sometimes I apologize for things long done and long forgiven. I tell her I still keep the small garden she loved, though the tomatoes no longer come out right. I tell her I tried with our son, Nathan. I really did. Nathan was a quiet boy, studious and cautious, the kind of child who wanted everyone to approve before he breathed. When his mother died, he changed. He became sharp-edged, impatient with grief, almost embarrassed by it. "We have to move on, Dad," he told me at the funeral reception, while people were still finishing their sandwiches. Mom wouldn't want us stuck in the past. Maybe he was right, but I remember thinking how fast he said it, how easily the words came. He met Linda not long after, a woman who smiled too much when other people were watching and rarely when they weren't. I told myself to be glad for him. A man needs someone beside him, even if that someone makes him smaller. When I sold our old house, the one Lorraine and I had lived in for 42 years, Nathan handled the paperwork. He said it was simpler that way. He transferred most of the money into a joint account. "So it'll be easier to pay bills, Dad." I didn't question it. My generation doesn't like to make trouble. But over time I noticed that easier meant I had no checkbook, no bank card, no say. My pension started landing in Nathan's account for consolidation. When I asked once, just out of curiosity, how much we had saved, he smiled the way people smile at a confused child. "Don't worry about it, Dad. You're set." The words were kind, but the tone carried a door closing behind them. I spend most days in my small room at the end of the hall. Linda calls it Dad's Corner, though it feels more like a waiting area in a doctor's office. My belongings fit on one bookshelf: old war medals, Lorraine's porcelain dove, a photo of me and Nathan fishing when he was 8. The television in the living room is a kingdom I am rarely invited into. Linda watches crime dramas at a volume meant to exclude conversation, while Nathan comes home late and eats alone. Once a week they let me sit with them for dinner, usually Sunday, though I suspect it's more from duty than desire. Conversation skims the surface. Weather, groceries, politics, all topics that evaporate before they reach meaning. Sometimes, when they forget I can hear them, I catch pieces of their true thoughts. "He's getting worse," Linda said one night while I pretended to read in my room. "He repeats himself, leaves the kettle on. I think it's time we considered assisted living." Nathan sighed, his voice a low current of resignation. "We can't afford that right now. Maybe later in the year." Later in the year, that elastic promise we make to the dying, to the elderly, to dreams we want to postpone. I sat there staring at the page, the words blurring into meaningless ink, and I felt a strange detachment, as if they were talking about someone else entirely. There was a time, not so long ago, when I was proud of my endurance. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, came back with a scar under my ribs and a tremor in my left hand that never quite went away. I built a life out of routine and responsibility, numbers balanced, bills paid, fences mended. I believed that if you stayed decent, life would eventually thank you. But old age has a cruel humor. It doesn't punish the wicked or reward the righteous. It simply narrows your world until the air itself feels borrowed. Most evenings I sit on the porch with the radio on low, listening to baseball games I no longer care about. It's not the game that matters, it's the voices, the play-by-play chatter that pretends the world is orderly and fair. The announcer says top of the 9th, bases loaded. And for a moment I can believe that outcomes still depend on effort. Then the commercial break comes, selling medications for arthritis, hearing loss, memory decline, as if they are cataloging my body. I turn the dial lower each time until only static remains. Nathan's children, my grandchildren, used to visit once a month. They stopped 2 years ago. College, part-time jobs, busy lives, Nathan says. I can't blame them entirely. To the young, the old are like museum pieces, curious, irrelevant, vaguely sad. I send them birthday cards, each with a $50 bill tucked inside. I never get a thank you, but I still send them. Lorraine would want that. I think the worst part isn't loneliness, it's invisibility. You can grow used to silence, but not to being unseen. Sometimes when I speak, they don't answer right away, as if my words have to travel farther, through thicker air. Other times they answer with polite half-smiles, like nurses reassuring a patient who won't recover. I started keeping a small notebook to write things down, names, errands, ideas for letters I'll never send. Just to remind myself I still think in complete sentences. Last month, Nathan suggested we take a trip. Just the 3 of us, he said brightly. A little road adventure down to Arkansas. You need some change of scenery. I was surprised. He hadn't invited me anywhere in years. Linda even smiled, said she'd booked a motel halfway down. We'll visit hot springs, maybe drive to the coast, she added, her voice too rehearsed. Something in me stirred. A cautious hope that maybe they were trying to reconnect, to make amends for the quiet neglect. I spent the next days packing carefully. 1 suitcase, my medications, my old army cap. I even polished my shoes, absurdly wanting to look presentable for people who no longer looked at me. The night before we left, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the dark kitchen, the linoleum cool beneath my feet, and stared out at the streetlights. A part of me feared it would be the last time I saw that familiar block, but I brushed the thought aside as morbid fancy. Lorraine's photograph stood on the counter, smiling in that gentle, knowing way she had. I touched the frame and whispered, "Maybe things will be better now, sweetheart. Maybe he's finally remembered he has a father." When morning came, the sky was washed in pale silver clouds. Nathan's car, a gray SUV, idled in the driveway. Linda honked twice, though she could see me through the window. I took one last look around the house, making sure the lights were off, the doors locked. The air smelled faintly of detergent and something else. Closure, perhaps. Nathan loaded my bag without comment. I climbed into the back seat, folded my cane across my knees, and smiled. "Ready when you are," I said. Linda adjusted the mirror to avoid looking at me. Nathan nodded and merged onto the highway. The trip had begun. I told myself that somewhere along those endless miles of asphalt, maybe between the gas stations and the fast food stops, we might still find the remnants of a family. I didn't know then that the road would strip away the last illusions I had, that before the week was over, I'd be standing 3 states away, alone on the side of the road, waiting for a miracle I no longer believed in. The first hours of the trip passed in that strange half-silence that families use when there is too much history to fill with small talk. Nathan kept his eyes fixed on the road, both hands on the steering wheel, posture straight, deliberate, as if driving itself were an act of discipline. Linda sat beside him, scrolling on her phone, occasionally showing him something on the screen that made them exchange quiet, clipped whispers. From the back seat, I watched the blurred fields of southern Missouri unroll like an old film, the world moving and yet remaining the same. The radio murmured old country songs I half remembered, and the steady rhythm of the tires hummed against the asphalt like a tired metronome. It should have felt like any other family trip, but there was something restrained in the air, an invisible distance I could neither name nor dispel. At first, I told myself not to overthink it. I asked about the grandchildren, about Nathan's work at the insurance firm, about the neighbor who used to borrow our mower years ago. They answered politely, briefly, without questions in return. After a while, I stopped trying. The conversation wilted like a houseplant left too long without water. I looked out the window instead, tracing the horizon where the clouds sat heavy and low. Somewhere beyond those gray shapes, rain waited. I thought it might be a relief, something real enough to acknowledge. By noon, we stopped at a diner just off the highway, one of those places where the walls are lined with license plates and the coffee tastes faintly of gasoline. Linda ordered salads for herself and Nathan, then turned to me. "You probably want soup, right, Dad? Something easy on the stomach." I opened my mouth to say I'd rather have a burger, but she was already handing the menus to the waitress. The gesture was small, almost kind, yet it carried the familiar undertone of control. I ate my soup quietly, listening to the chatter of truckers at the counter. They laughed with an ease that made me ache. When we left, I left a few crumpled dollars on the table. Linda gave me a look as though generosity were an embarrassment. Back on the road, the rain finally arrived, soft at first, then insistent. The wipers squeaked across the windshield in uneven intervals, and the car filled with that muffled sound of water closing the world in. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, we were pulling into a gas station somewhere past Little Rock. A faded sign announced, "Dixie Stop, hot coffee, cold drinks, clean restrooms." Nathan cut the engine and turned in his seat. "We'll take a quick break," he said. "Use the restroom, stretch your legs. We got a few hours left." His tone was cheerful but mechanical, like a tour guide reciting a script. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of damp asphalt and oil. I stepped out, legs stiff, and walked toward the restroom at the side of the building. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, reflecting off cracked tiles. I splashed water on my face, studied the lines around my eyes. For a moment, I didn't recognize the man looking back, a face softened by time, emptied of certainty. I thought about Lorraine and how she would have laughed at me fussing with my collar. "You still care too much about appearances," she used to say. "The world doesn't notice, Arvin." She was right. The world rarely does. When I came back out, the parking lot was strangely quiet. 2 pickups idled by the pumps, and a young attendant smoked under the canopy, his phone glowing in his hand. Nathan's SUV wasn't there. I frowned, scanning the lot. Maybe he had moved it to the side. Maybe he was checking the tires or running an errand inside the shop. I walked to the door, glanced in. The clerk behind the counter, a thin man with a trucker cap, looked up from his magazine. "You seen a gray SUV?" I asked. "My son was just here." The man shrugged. "Couple cars been through. Not sure which one you mean." I stepped back outside, my heart ticking faster. The space where the SUV had been was just wet pavement now, dark and gleaming under the weak sun. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. I told myself there must be some misunderstanding, that they'd driven off to find an ATM or missed the exit and would circle back any moment. But the minutes stretched, the traffic thinned, and realization began to seep through denial like cold water into a shoe. They were gone. I stood there with my cane, feeling the world tilt slightly off its axis. My wallet was in my jacket, but my phone, my only real tether, had been left in the car's cup holder where I'd set it after checking the time earlier. The absurdity of it hit me. 3 states away from home, no phone, no address memorized, except the vague destination of the coast. I told myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe Linda was angry about something trivial, and they'd gone to cool off. Maybe they'd thought I was already inside the store, and we'd simply missed each other. I walked the length of the parking lot twice, peered behind the pumps, the dumpsters, even the adjoining car wash bay, as if the vehicle might magically reappear if I looked hard enough. The clerk watched me from inside, wary now. When I came back to the counter, I tried to keep my voice steady. "Could I use your phone, son? Just need to call my family." He hesitated. "Store policy says it's for employees only, but there's a payphone by the highway." I turned to where he pointed, a rusted booth half hidden behind a vending machine. I fumbled in my pocket for coins and found none. My pension wallet had bills, no change. The young man must have seen something in my face because he added, "Sorry, sir, I don't got any quarters either." He went back to his magazine, problem solved. For a long moment I stood under the canopy, the smell of gasoline thick in my nose, the noise of passing trucks echoing off the wet asphalt. Cars came and went, strangers with destinations, each one a small reminder that the world kept moving without me. I walked to the curb, sat down on the concrete edge. A dog barked somewhere behind the station. The sky cleared to that washed-out blue that follows heavy rain. An hour passed, then another. The clerk changed shifts. A heavier man replaced him and gave me a curious glance, but said nothing. My legs trembled from the effort of standing too long. I began to imagine reasons, stories that would make this abandonment temporary, forgivable. Maybe they had an accident and couldn't come back. Maybe they thought I'd left with someone else. But beneath those desperate possibilities, a colder truth was forming. This was intentional. When the sun began to dip, painting the pumps in long shadows, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle on me like a damp coat. I needed somewhere to go, but I didn't know where somewhere was. I looked up at the road, the endless ribbon of interstate cutting through flat land, and for the first time in years, I felt small. Not old, just small, like a child lost in a crowd. That's when I heard the deep rumble of an approaching engine, heavier than a car, more deliberate. A long-haul truck slowed near the exit, its brakes sighing. It rolled to a stop beside the curb, chrome catching the last light of day. The driver leaned out of the window, a broad man with a weathered face and a shock of white hair beneath his cap. "You need a lift, old-timer?" he called. His voice was deep, familiar in a way that tugged at something buried under decades. I squinted, shielding my eyes from the sun. "John?" I said, hardly trusting the sound of my own voice. The man blinked, then broke into a slow grin. "Well, I'll be damned. Arvin Clay? You're the last person I expected to see standing at a gas station in Arkansas." I felt my knees weaken with disbelief and something like gratitude. The years between us collapsed in that instant. The noise of the jungle, the stench of smoke and sweat, the terrified laughter of men too young to die. John Mason had been my commanding officer once, later a lawyer, and as I'd heard through old comrades, eventually a federal judge. And now here he was, climbing down from his rig, still built like a fortress, his eyes sharp with recognition. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, clapping a hand on my shoulder. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The story was too absurd to tell, yet too real to hide. He studied me for a moment, reading the silence. "Come on," he said finally, motioning toward the truck. "Let's get you out of here. You can tell me everything on the road." I climbed up into the cab, the smell of diesel and coffee enveloping me, and as the engine growled to life, I looked through the windshield at the shrinking gas station, that lonely island of asphalt where one life had ended and another, unexpectedly, was beginning. The cab smelled faintly of engine oil and black coffee, the kind of scent that settles into the fabric of a man's life when he spent years on the road. John drove with the calm precision of someone who had been behind the wheel for half a century, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes alert despite the fading light. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence two old soldiers share when words are too clumsy to hold everything that needs to be said. The hum of the diesel engine filled the space where explanations might have gone, and I felt, for the first time that day, that I was safe enough to breathe. When I finally began to talk, the words came out haltingly at first, like a confession dragged from deep water. I told him about Nathan, about the years since Lorraine's death, about the slow unraveling of trust that had left me a guest in my own family. I told him about the road trip, the soup, the rain, the gas station, the vanished car. I tried to keep my voice steady, but somewhere between the details, shame crept in. There's a peculiar humiliation in being abandoned not by strangers, but by blood. John didn't interrupt. He just kept driving, eyes fixed on the darkening highway ahead, jaw tightening a little every time I faltered. When I finished, there was a long pause broken only by the sound of rain beginning again on the windshield. "That's a hell of a thing," he said finally, his voice low, almost disbelieving. "They just left you there." I nodded, feeling smaller for having admitted it out loud. 3 states away from home. No phone, no way to reach anyone. He shook his head slowly. "Jesus, Arvin, you were always the sensible one. What the hell happened to people?" I didn't know how to answer that. Maybe nothing had happened to people at all. Maybe it was just time, grinding down the shape of things, until even family didn't look like family anymore. He turned the truck onto a side road lined with pine trees that blurred together under the rain. "I got a place in Memphis," he said. "Spare room. You'll stay with me a while till we figure this out." I started to protest, some remnant of pride kicking weakly, but he cut me off. "Don't start. You're not going back to that damn gas station motel, and you're not sleeping under a bridge. You'll come home with me." The word home struck deeper than he knew. The drive took hours. The rain thickened, turning the highway into a silver river under the headlights. I watched the reflection of passing cars ripple across the windshield and thought of Nathan's face that morning, calm and businesslike, as he'd loaded my bag into the trunk. He hadn't looked angry or even conflicted. That was what haunted me most. The absence of struggle, as if leaving me had been as ordinary as dropping off dry cleaning. I wondered if he and Linda were laughing somewhere now, telling themselves it had been necessary, that I'd forced their hand. People can justify anything when they give it enough distance. By the time we crossed into Tennessee, the rain had faded to mist. The truck rolled through the outskirts of Memphis, where the streetlights glowed pale and sleepy against the wet pavement. John lived on a quiet residential street not far from the river. The house was 2 stories, brick, well kept, but lived in. The kind of place that told you its owner still cared about it. He parked in the driveway and turned to me. "You're home for the night? No arguments?" I managed a tired smile. "You always were bossy." "Kept us alive back then, didn't it?" he said, and for the first time in days I laughed. Inside, the warmth hit me like a blessing. The entryway smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Photographs lined the hallway. John in uniform, John shaking hands with governors, John standing beside a woman with kind eyes whom I assumed was his late wife. He showed me to a small guest room upstairs, neat and comfortable, a patchwork quilt folded over the bed. "Bathroom's next door. If you need anything, shout," he said, pausing at the doorway. "Arvin, you're safe here, all right? Don't worry about anything tonight." When he left, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, listening to the hum of the house and the distant rumble of traffic outside. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty stretch of pavement behind the gas station, the shrinking taillights of a car that never turned around. I kept trying to recall some sign, some hint that this had been planned. Had Linda's smile been too wide when she handed me the soup? Had Nathan avoided my eyes when he said, "Quick break"? The memories replayed themselves like broken film. Eventually, I gave up trying to sleep and sat by the window, watching the rain return, soft and steady, whispering against the glass. It felt like a conversation only the lonely can understand. In the morning, John was already up, dressed in a pressed shirt and slacks, sipping coffee at the kitchen table, with a newspaper spread before him. The years hadn't dulled his discipline. "You still take it black?" he asked. I nodded, and he poured me a cup. The first sip burned slightly, grounding me back in the living. "You've got that look," he said after a moment. "The one you had before we went into Da Nang, when you were trying to decide whether to be brave or smart." I smiled faintly. "What's the smart move now?" "Get your life back," he said simply. He made a few calls that morning, one to a colleague who owed him favors, another to a lawyer he trusted. I sat in the living room, listening to his voice carry down the hall, authoritative and calm. It was strange to see him like this. The same man who once shared rations with me in the jungle, now speaking in the measured tones of power. When he came back, he handed me a notebook. "Write down everything," he said. "Dates, bank details, any documents your son had you sign. We'll find out exactly where you stand." It took most of the day. As I went through the memories, small details surfaced that I'd ignored before. How Nathan insisted on handling my mail, how Linda started reminding me of my forgetfulness, how they'd slowly cut me out of my own affairs while smiling all the while. I felt a kind of slow horror build, not from what they had done, but from how easily I'd let them do it. "They might have tried to take control of your assets," John said when I showed him what I'd written. "It's not uncommon. People call it guardianship fraud. Families do it all the time when money's involved." I stared at him, the words foreign and heavy. "Families," I repeated. "You mean strangers with the same last name." He didn't argue. That evening he took me to dinner at a small place near the river. The waitress greeted him by name. Apparently Judge Mason was well known here. As we ate, I asked him about his life, and for a while the conversation turned light. He told me about his daughter teaching law at the university, his grandchildren's endless appetite for sugar, his retirement plans that never quite stuck. But every time the talk drifted back to me, his face tightened again. "You know," he said finally, "we used to think the enemy was easy to recognize. Uniform, flag, rifle. Turns out The hardest battles are the ones that look like family dinners. That night, when I returned to my room, his words echoed in my mind. I realized then that what had happened at the gas station wasn't an accident or even a moment of cruelty. It was the culmination of years of erosion, of small betrayals disguised as care. I thought of Lorraine again, how she'd always said, "Don't let kindness blind you, Arvin. People hide behind it when they want something." She'd known more than I gave her credit for. Before bed, I called the bank from John's landline. The woman on the other end recognized my name, but hesitated when I asked about the joint account. "I'm sorry, Mr. Clay," she said, "but according to our records, your son has full power of attorney. Any changes require his consent." My stomach dropped. I thanked her and hung up, my hands trembling. When I told John, he frowned. "That's not legal if you didn't sign it knowingly. We'll contest it." His certainty was comforting, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. Lying in bed, I felt the slow burn of anger mix with grief. For years I'd mistaken dependence for love, compliance for peace. I had handed over my life piece by piece because I thought that was what good fathers did. Now I saw the cost of that trust lying bare before me. Out there, miles away, my son and his wife were probably erasing me, closing accounts, rewriting narratives, explaining to whoever asked that the old man was confused, that it was better this way. Maybe they even believed it. People always find a way to believe the stories that make them less cruel. As the night deepened, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not fade away quietly. I would not be erased like a smudge on a family photograph. Whatever years I had left, they would belong to me again. And if justice still existed in this world, and in men like John Mason, I would find it. Outside, the rain stopped, leaving the air heavy and clean. Somewhere down the street, a train whistle blew, long and lonely, the sound of departure and arrival all at once. I sat up and whispered into the dark, not to Lorraine this time, but to myself. "It's not over yet." The following week unfolded in a quiet rhythm that felt both foreign and strangely comforting. For the first time in years, I awoke in a house where no one sighed when I entered the kitchen, where my coffee was my own, where conversation was offered instead of rationed. John's place had the warmth of a home that still believed in civility. Books filled every corner, papers sprawled across the desk, and an old dog named Jasper slept under the table, twitching in dreams of open fields. I would sit there in the mornings while John prepared for his day. He still went to the courthouse twice a week, handling a reduced docket since his partial retirement. And we would talk the way men used to talk, before time made them cautious, about work, duty, the weight of survival, and how quietly betrayal seeps into a man's bones before he even recognizes it. It was during those mornings that I realized how deeply I had been starved not of love, but of respect. There's a peculiar dignity that comes from being looked in the eye, from having your words treated as something worth hearing. I hadn't felt that in years. Yet beneath the calm surface, I sensed a tension gathering, the way clouds gather long before a storm. John was discreet about it, but I could see he was already setting things in motion. His lawyer friend, a sharp-measured woman named Denise Holloway, came by one afternoon. She had kind eyes bespoke like a scalpel, precise, quick, with no room for sentiment. She asked questions that made me flinch. When was the last time I'd signed a document? What exactly had I agreed to? Who managed my pension, my medical accounts, my property? Each answer seemed to deepen the crease between her eyebrows. When we finished, she closed her notebook and said softly, "Mr. Clay, you may have been declared legally dependent without full consent. If that's the case, your son could have access to every financial decision you've ever made." The words landed with the weight of a verdict. I sat there, stunned, staring at the rim of my coffee cup, as if it could tell me what dignity remained. John reached over, placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "We'll get it back," he said. Denise nodded. "We'll start by freezing any accounts tied to that power of attorney. Once we prove incapacity wasn't verified by a legitimate physician, we can reverse it." Her tone was practical, unemotional, but I could sense the quiet anger underneath, the kind that professionals learn to contain, but never quite extinguish. For the first time since that gas station, I felt something stir inside me that wasn't despair. It was the faint, unfamiliar pulse of resolve. Over the next days, Denise and John worked in tandem. Calls were made, papers requested, forms filed. I watched from the sidelines, alternately grateful and ashamed, like a man observing the rescue of someone he barely recognizes as himself. At night, when the house fell silent except for Jasper's breathing, I would sit by the window and think about Nathan. I tried to imagine what story he was telling now, to his colleagues, his friends, perhaps even to the bank clerks. "My father's mind isn't what it used to be," he might say, with that measured tone of quiet tragedy people use when they want to be admired for their patience. "It's for his own good, really." I could almost hear Linda adding, "He forgets things. He gets confused. We're just trying to protect him." The thought made my stomach tighten. They weren't villains, I knew that. Villains act with clarity. This was worse. People convincing themselves that cruelty was kindness. One evening, John invited me to dinner with his daughter, Claire. She was in her 40s, elegant in that effortless way educated women have, but her handshake was firm and genuine. Over dinner, she asked careful questions about my life, about Lorraine, about the grandchildren I hadn't seen in years. When I hesitated, embarrassed by the unraveling of my story, she leaned forward and said, "Don't apologize. People love to pretend these things don't happen, but they do, more often than anyone admits." Her sympathy wasn't pity, and that difference almost undid me. I had forgotten how it felt to be treated as someone still capable of choice. Later, when she and John cleared the dishes, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to their laughter drift through the open window. For a brief moment, I let myself believe that maybe I'd been given another chance, a late reprieve from whatever sentence life had handed me. But the world has a way of reminding you that peace is temporary. The following morning, a courier delivered a large envelope addressed to me. Inside were copies of documents with my signature, pages I barely remembered signing, each one more damning than the last. Transfer of property, authorization for medical oversight, confirmation of limited guardianship. The signatures were mine, neat and deliberate, yet I had no memory of agreeing to any of it. I brought the papers to John's study, my hands shaking. "They must have had me sign these after Lorraine's death," I said. I was still numb then. I'd have signed anything if Nathan told me it was routine. John skimmed the pages, his jaw tightening. "This isn't routine. This is manipulation." That afternoon, Denise returned with a notary and a plan. "We'll file a petition for revocation of power of attorney," she said. "Once the court accepts it, all accounts revert to you until a full review." I signed every line she indicated, my hand steady now. Somewhere between humiliation and exhaustion, I had crossed into a different state, the clarity that comes when you stop expecting fairness and start demanding it. Days later, the phone rang while John was out. A voice I hadn't heard in months came through the receiver. "Dad?" It was Nathan. The sound was tentative, almost rehearsed. For a heartbeat, I wanted to believe it was concern, that maybe he'd realized the enormity of what he'd done. But as he spoke, that illusion crumbled. "You shouldn't be making trouble," he said, his tone tightening. Linda and I have been trying to handle your affairs responsibly. You're not well, and dragging lawyers into this won't help anyone. I felt my pulse quicken. Not well, I repeated. I've never been clearer in my life. He sighed, that weary exhale I'd heard so many times, the sound of a man tired of his own father's existence. You don't understand the world anymore, Dad. Things have changed. You should be grateful we're looking out for you. I almost laughed then, not out of humor, but disbelief. Grateful. The word clanged in my ears like irony sharpened to a blade. You left me at a gas station, I said quietly. 3 states away from home. Tell me again about gratitude. There was silence on the line, the kind that stretches just long enough to confirm guilt. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. You're imagining things. You must have wandered off. Before I could answer, the line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, holding the receiver like an artifact from another life. Then I placed it gently back in its cradle, as if it might shatter from the weight of truth. That night, the past and present collided in my dreams. I was back in Vietnam, standing in the monsoon with John beside me, radio static crackling in our ears. The jungle smelled of rot and fear. But we were young then, and the danger felt like purpose. When I woke, the room was dark, but for a moment I couldn't tell if the sound I heard was thunder or my own heartbeat. Betrayal has its own weather. It moves through you like heat lightning, silent until it burns. By the end of the week, Denise confirmed what we'd suspected. The bank had frozen my accounts, pending investigation. Several transactions had been flagged. Large withdrawals, transfers to Nathan's name, purchases I'd never made. We'll get most of it back, she assured me. It might take months, but the paper trail is clear. I thanked her, though words felt inadequate. John stood beside me, arms crossed, his expression caught somewhere between fury and pride. You've been through worse, he said softly. You can survive this too. That evening, as we sat by the river, the air heavy with the scent of magnolias, John said something that stayed with me long after. You know, Arvin, the hardest thing about growing old isn't the pain or the loneliness. It's watching decency turn negotiable. We were raised to believe that some lines couldn't be crossed. Turns out they just needed the right excuse. I looked at him, his profile etched against the dusk, and I understood he wasn't talking only about my son. He was talking about the whole damn world. When we walked back to the truck, he asked if I'd like to come to court with him the next morning. It's a routine hearing, nothing dramatic, but you might find it interesting, he said. I agreed. I hadn't set foot in a courthouse in decades, and the idea of witnessing order, rules, structure, accountability felt strangely comforting. As we drove home, the city lights shimmered on the wet asphalt, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that maybe the truth still had somewhere to live. That night, I couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't fear that kept me awake. It was anticipation. Something had shifted. I was no longer the man waiting to be rescued. I was the man preparing to reclaim what was his. Lorraine's picture sat on the nightstand, her smile faint in the dim light. I touched the frame gently and whispered, You'd laugh at me, wouldn't you? Old fool finally learning to fight when there's nothing left to win. But she wouldn't have laughed. She would have nodded, patient and proud, the way she always did when I took too long to understand what mattered. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, distant but certain, and I knew it was only the beginning of the storm. The courthouse the next morning was built of pale stone and glass, a modern structure that seemed almost too bright to contain the kinds of human failures that gathered within it. John walked ahead of me through the wide foyer, his steps measured, his presence commanding even in silence. Men like him carried authority the way other people carried posture. It wasn't learned, it was ingrained. I followed him through the metal detectors and the long corridors lined with bulletin boards and flags, each step echoing with a rhythm that reminded me of marching drills from another life. I didn't know why he wanted me to come. Perhaps he sensed I needed to see justice operating in the flesh, to remember that systems still existed where truth could matter. He wasn't presiding that morning, just observing, but the clerks greeted him with quiet respect, nodding as we passed. The hearing itself was minor. Property dispute, some family arguing over a will. But as I listened, I saw pieces of my own story reflected in theirs. The daughter claimed the father had promised her the house. The son said there was no written proof. The old man in question sat slumped in the back row, eyes closed, as if he'd already surrendered the outcome. I found myself staring at him, wondering if that was how I had looked not long ago. Tired, compliant, resigned. John leaned toward me and whispered, "See that? That's how they win. Not by force, but by fatigue." I nodded, the truth of it sinking deeper than I wanted to admit. After the session, John introduced me to a young associate named Harris, who handled research for his firm. Harris was sharp, eager, the kind of man who saw the law as a chessboard. "We've been reviewing your case," he said, shaking my hand. "There's something odd. Your son filed a declaration of cognitive decline last year, attached to a medical certificate from a Dr. L. Wentworth in Springfield. Do you know this physician?" I shook my head. "Never heard the name." Harris exchanged a glance with John. "Then it's fraudulent. We'll subpoena the clinic records to confirm." I stood there in the corridor, absorbing the fact that my own child had apparently hired a doctor to invent my decline. It was one thing to be abandoned. It was another to be rewritten. By the time we left the courthouse, the day had grown hot and thick with humidity. We walked along the riverfront in silence for a while, before John finally said, "They'll try to paint you as incompetent, you know. That's the only card they have left." His words weren't cruel, just factual. "Then let them," I said. "I'll prove otherwise." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something like pride flicker behind the concern. That's the Arvin I remember. In the days that followed, the pressure built. Letters began arriving at John's address. Legal notices, formal objections, a written demand from Nathan's attorney insisting that I cease harassment and withdraw all petitions. Denise read them calmly, sorting them into piles. "Bluster," she said. "They're trying to intimidate you. It means we're close." Yet the more evidence we gathered, the more the magnitude of the deception revealed itself. Not only had Nathan assumed control of my pension and savings, but he had also sold the remainder of Lorraine's jewelry, pieces that were meant for the grandchildren, and listed my old truck in his name. Each discovery felt like another nail closing over the coffin of whatever affection I had left for him. One night, unable to sleep, I went downstairs for water and found John in the den, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across his face. He looked up when I entered. "You should be resting," he said. "You're not on trial yet." I smiled faintly. "Feels like I am." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. There's something I need to tell you." He hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I called an old contact at the Social Security office. Your son's been receiving your benefit payments directly for almost a year. He filed the paperwork himself under that false guardianship order. If we can prove fraud, it's a felony." The words didn't shock me anymore. They only deepened the hollow that had replaced my anger. "He'll lose everything," I said quietly. John nodded. "He already has, Arvin. He just doesn't know it yet." The next morning the phone rang again. This time it was Linda. Her voice was high, brittle, the kind of tone people use when rehearsed composure begins to crack. "You're making a fool of yourself," she said before I could speak. "Dragging this into court, accusing your own son. It's disgusting." I could hear the tremor beneath the anger. "You left me by the side of the road," I replied evenly. "Do you deny that?" There was a pause long enough to expose the truth she couldn't admit. "You wandered off," she said at last. "We came back, but you were gone. We called the police." "You didn't call anyone," I said, my voice calm now, almost detached. "But you will be hearing from them soon enough." She hissed something under her breath before hanging up, and the click of the receiver felt like a door slamming on whatever illusion of family still lingered. Later that day, Denise received a formal counter-petition from Nathan's lawyer, claiming that I was acting under the influence of an outside party, meaning John, and that my mental competence required immediate evaluation. When she read it aloud, John chuckled darkly. "They're calling me a manipulator? That's rich." I wasn't laughing. "They'll drag this through the mud," I said. Denise nodded. "They always do. But we have the advantage of truth." A week later, she arranged for an independent psychiatric assessment. The doctor, a middle-aged man with calm eyes and a slow way of speaking, spent nearly 2 hours with me, asking about my memory, my finances, my understanding of current events. I answered every question plainly, without hesitation. When he finished, he smiled. "Mr. Clay, I've met many people half your age with less clarity." He signed his report on the spot. Denise looked relieved. John looked satisfied. For me, it was something deeper, a reclamation, as if each question I answered correctly rebuilt a small piece of the self my family had tried to erase. The case escalated quickly after that. The court granted a preliminary injunction freezing all assets under Nathan's control and ordered a full audit of transactions made in my name. The local paper caught wind of the story. Elder fraud allegations against prominent insurance executive. And within days, Nathan's company placed him on leave. I didn't rejoice. I just sat on the porch that evening with John, listening to the cicadas, feeling the slow unwinding of inevitability. I didn't want revenge, I told him. I just wanted to be treated like I still existed. He nodded, eyes on the horizon. Sometimes justice looks like revenge to people who've forgotten fairness. But the fight wasn't over. Nathan wasn't done. 2 nights later, a black SUV idled across the street from John's house. I noticed it from the window just before midnight. The engine hummed, lights off, motionless. For half an hour it stayed, then slowly pulled away. I told John the next morning, but he only shrugged. "They're watching to see if you'll slip up. Don't give them the satisfaction." Still, I felt the unease settle in my chest. Old habits from the war die hard. Surveillance never feels benign. Then came the envelope, no return address, postmarked from Springfield. Inside was a photograph, me sitting on the courthouse steps beside John, the caption scrawled in marker. "You'll regret this." I stared at it for a long time, the cheap paper trembling slightly in my hand. John looked at it once, then tore it in half. "Fear is their last weapon," he said. "If they can't control your money, they'll try to control your mind." A few days later, Denise called with unexpected news. "The judge has expedited the case. Preliminary hearing next Tuesday. Be ready to testify." I felt my throat tighten. "Testify?" "Yes," she said. "They'll want to hear directly from you. Just tell the truth. That's all you need." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. The thought of standing in a courtroom facing my son made my hands go cold. Not from fear of judgment, but from the anticipation of seeing in his eyes what I already knew, that he felt no remorse, only inconvenience. That weekend, I went through the small box of personal items I'd salvaged when I left home. Among the papers was an old letter from Lorraine, written during my first deployment. Her handwriting was small and looping, the ink faded to sepia. "Promise me you'll never let bitterness eat you alive," she'd written. "The world doesn't need another man who confuses anger with purpose." I read it 3 times, each word pressing deeper into memory. She hadn't known then that decades later, I'd be fighting a war not for survival, but for the right to remain myself. The day of the hearing arrived clear and warm. The courtroom was crowded, reporters seated in the back, the air thick with the tension of scandal. And Nathan sat at the opposing table in a tailored suit, his face drawn tight, eyes avoiding mine. Linda was beside him, her expression a mixture of defiance and unease. I could see in her posture the kind of brittle arrogance that cracks under pressure. When I took the stand, I felt the eyes of everyone in the room, but I spoke slowly, carefully, not to impress, but to be understood. I described the gas station, the waiting, the realization, the silence that followed. I told them about the documents I never remembered signing, about the accounts I could no longer access, about the voice on the phone that called betrayal protection. I didn't cry, and I didn't plead. I just told the truth. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge, a stern woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Clay," she said, "is there anything you wish from this court beyond restitution?" I thought for a moment, then said, "Just acknowledgement that I am not a ghost." A murmur rippled through the audience. The judge nodded slowly. "Duly noted." Nathan refused to meet my eyes when his turn came. His lawyer spoke for him, spinning tales of confusion, miscommunication, concern for my well-being. But when the forged medical report was produced, the room shifted. The doctor listed on it had never examined me. His signature was falsified. Even Linda flinched when the clerk read the finding aloud. The judge called for recess. I watched my son then, the boy who once clung to my leg when thunder scared him, now a man cornered by his own greed. There was no satisfaction in it, only the quiet understanding that love and accountability rarely coexist. Outside, as John and I walked down the courthouse steps, he placed a hand on my back. "You did good in there," he said. I exhaled slowly, feeling the sunlight on my face. "I don't know if good is the word. Necessary, maybe." He nodded. "Sometimes they're the same." That night, back at his house, I sat alone on the porch while the sky turned the color of rust. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle rose and fell, long and mournful. The war was not over, not yet. But for the first time, I believed I might live to see the end of it. Justice was slow, flawed, human, but it was moving, inch by inch, toward the truth. And that, I thought, was enough to keep breathing. The days between the hearing and the verdict passed like a slow fever, filled with the strange stillness that comes when you know your life is being measured behind closed doors. John tried to distract me with errands, walks along the river, long dinners where conversation drifted toward safer subjects. But my mind always returned to that courtroom, to the way Nathan sat rigid beside his lawyer, to the faint tremor in his hand when the forged medical papers were displayed. I told myself that I wasn't angry anymore, that anger was a younger man's game, but the truth was less noble. Beneath the quiet surface of my composure, something hot and hard kept moving, a need not for vengeance, but for recognition, for the world to see what had been done to me and to say, without hesitation, that it was wrong. When the verdict day came, the courthouse was half full again, though the reporters had mostly vanished, their hunger satisfied by fresher scandals. Denise sat beside me, her files neatly stacked, her expression calm. John was behind us, his presence like a silent shield. Nathan entered with Linda, both dressed in deliberate restraint, dark suits, somber faces, the performance of contrition. I barely looked at them. I was past expecting remorse. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and the murmurs faded into a taut silence that made every breath sound intrusive. The proceedings began with the financial audit report. The clerk read it aloud, each line another incision into the fiction my son had built. Unauthorized withdrawals, forged signatures, property transfers, pension diversions. Numbers that once represented decades of work now told a different story, one of deceit wrapped in legality. I didn't look at Nathan, but I could feel his stillness, the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have just discovered the limits of their control. When the clerk finished, the judge's gaze shifted to him. "Mr. Clay," she said, "do you have anything to say before the court delivers its decision?" Nathan's lawyer rose, whispered something urgently, but Nathan shook his head. For a moment, I thought he might finally tell the truth. Instead, he stood and said, "I did what I thought was best for my father." His voice was steady, but empty. "He's not the same man he used to be. He needed structure. I made sure he was cared for." The judge tilted her head slightly, unimpressed. "You mean you ensured control," she said. The words landed like stones. Nathan's jaw tightened. "He doesn't understand. He forgets things. He can't—" He stopped, realizing too late that the only person he was convincing was himself. When the judge asked if I wished to respond, I stood. The courtroom was too small suddenly, the air thick with memory and humiliation, and the strange weight of time. I didn't have notes. I hadn't prepared anything. I just spoke. "There was a time when I trusted that man with everything I had," I began, my voice low but clear. "Not because he earned it, but because he was my son. When his mother died, I told him the one thing she made me promise, to protect him, to believe in him. And I did. I signed papers I didn't read because I thought no harm could come from love. I let him take over my life because I believed family meant safety. But love without respect is just submission, and kindness without honesty is manipulation. What he did to me wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, repeated day after day, until there was nothing of me left but his convenience." I paused then, feeling my throat tighten, but I kept going. If the law can give me back my name, my independence, my dignity, then I ask for that. I don't want revenge. I want freedom, from pity, from guardianship, from the quiet cruelty of being spoken for. I want to live as myself, even if I die alone. The room was silent when I finished. Even the judge seemed to take a moment before responding. Her voice, when it came, was measured but softer. "Mr. Clay, the court finds sufficient evidence of fraud, coercion, and abuse of fiduciary responsibility. All guardianship documents are hereby revoked, and full financial and legal independence is restored to you effective immediately." She turned toward Nathan. "Mr. Nathan Clay, the matter of criminal fraud will be referred to the district attorney's office for review. In addition, this court orders restitution of all misappropriated funds and property." Nathan's face drained of color, his composure unraveling as if the structure holding him upright had finally cracked. Linda's hand twitched toward his, but he pulled away, staring down at the table as though the grain of the wood might offer escape. When the gavel struck again, ending the session, the sound felt like both punishment and release. Denise exhaled softly beside me. John squeezed my shoulder once, his hand steady and warm. I didn't move right away. My body felt heavy, as if I'd been holding my breath for months and now couldn't remember how to exhale. Nathan stood, hesitated, then turned toward me. For the first time in years, our eyes met. I expected fury or defiance, but what I saw instead was something closer to fear. Fear not of prison or disgrace, but of the emptiness that comes when manipulation no longer works. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Linda tugged his sleeve, and together they left, their footsteps receding into the long marble hallway, until only silence remained. Outside, the sunlight was sharp and white, reflecting off the courthouse steps like a challenge. Reporters lingered at a distance, but no one approached. John and Denise spoke quietly behind me, discussing follow-up filings and restitution logistics, but I barely heard them. I walked a few steps away to the edge of the plaza, where a fountain murmured in the heat. The water caught the light like glass, endless and unhurried. I leaned on my cane and watched it for a long time. I thought about the years I had spent shrinking myself to fit into a life that no longer had room for me. I thought about Lorraine's voice, the way she would have said, "You see, even after all this, you're still here." When John finally caught up, he said gently, "You did more than win a case today, Arvin." I turned to him, puzzled. "You made them look at you. That's more than most men get in the end." I smiled faintly. "It only took losing everything. Sometimes that's the price of being seen." We walked back to his truck in silence. That evening, I sat on the porch of his house while the sun sank low over the rooftops, painting everything in deep gold. Jasper lay at my feet, his breath slow and steady. The neighborhood children were playing somewhere down the street, their laughter floating like a language from another world. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like an intruder in someone else's life. I was simply alive, tired, bruised, but undeniably myself. When John joined me with 2 glasses of bourbon, we didn't toast or speak for a while. The silence was companionable, full of the kind of peace that doesn't need explanation. After a long time, he said, "You ever think about calling him again?" I shook my head slowly. What would I say? That I forgive him? Would you? I looked at the horizon where the light was fading. "Not yet," I said. "Maybe one day. But forgiveness should never be cheaper than justice." He nodded, satisfied, and we sat until the first stars appeared. Later that night, when I finally went inside, I passed the mirror in the hallway and paused. For the first time in years, the reflection that looked back didn't seem like a stranger waiting for permission to exist. The lines were still there, the years still carved deep, but behind them was something steady, something that had survived the fire and come out the other side still speaking in its own voice. I reached out and touched the glass lightly, as if to confirm that I was still real, and in that quiet moment I realized the truth that had been waiting beneath all the noise. Losing everything had given me back myself. Autumn came to Memphis slowly, in shades of copper and quiet gold that made the afternoons stretch longer than they should. The days grew softer, the light gentler, and the air carried that faint ache of endings that the old recognize before anyone else. I rented a small house on the edge of town, a simple place with a porch that faced west and a patch of soil in the back, where I planted tomatoes that refused to thrive, but at least tried. John helped me move the few things I owned, mostly books, photographs, and a wooden box with Lorraine's letters. When he left that evening, the rooms felt too still, but not in the suffocating way they used to. It was the stillness of something clean, something waiting to be filled by the sound of my own life returning. The first weeks alone were difficult in the ordinary ways. Quiet mornings that felt too large. Nights when the sound of my heartbeat filled the house. I had to relearn small things. How to shop for myself. How to manage bills. How to trust that the world wouldn't collapse if I made a decision without asking anyone's permission. Every step felt like a reclamation, even the clumsy ones. Denise called regularly to update me on the final stages of restitution. Most of the money was to be returned, though she warned that some of it might never come back. I told her it didn't matter. Money can be earned, I said. Dignity has to be rebuilt. She smiled through the phone. You've already started. John visited often. He'd bring Jasper, who immediately claimed my porch as his second kingdom, sprawling across the boards like a century of peace. Sometimes John would stay for supper, and we'd talk about nothing in particular. The weather, the stubborn tomatoes, the neighbors' endless renovations. Other nights we'd sit in silence, sharing that unspoken understanding between men who have already survived the worst parts of themselves. There was comfort in that, the kind that doesn't announce itself but quietly steadies your hands when you reach for a glass. One evening in late October, I received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. It was from Nathan. The first line simply said, "I don't expect forgiveness." He wrote that he had lost his job, that Linda had left, that he was trying to start over somewhere in Oklahoma. He claimed he hadn't meant to hurt me, that things had got out of control, that he believed he was protecting me from my own age. I read it twice, slowly, searching for sincerity, for some fragment of the boy who once built model airplanes with me on summer evenings while Lorraine laughed from the porch. But the words were hollow, written more for his absolution than for my understanding. At the bottom he had added, "I hope you're all right." That was all. I folded the letter, placed it in the box with Lorraine's, and closed the lid. I didn't feel anger, just a quiet exhaustion, like someone who has walked a long way through rain and finally stepped under shelter. The town soon became familiar. People at the grocery store began to recognize me. The postman waved. The woman at the library saved me the local paper. I joined a small veterans group that met every Thursday at a diner off the highway. We talked about old days, but never the worst parts, only the details that time had polished into something bearable. One of them asked if I'd ever gone back to see my family. I said no. He nodded, understanding without questions. Among old soldiers, silence often means respect. Sometimes, when the evening light slants just right through the kitchen window, I imagine Lorraine standing there, her hands dusted with flour, humming the same tune she always did when she cooked. I tell her about my day, about how the tomatoes are still stubborn, about how Jasper has learned to beg for scraps, about how John insists on checking the locks every time he visits, as if I were still in his command. I tell her that I'm fine, that I'm living again, that I finally understand what she meant when she said the hardest part of love is knowing when to let it rest. As winter approached, I felt the old ache of loneliness, but it wasn't the sharp kind anymore. It was gentler, like a scar that aches when the weather changes, reminding you of what healed rather than what was lost. I found a small rhythm to my days. Coffee at dawn, a walk by the river, letters written and sometimes not sent. Life had shrunk, but it had also deepened. There was space again for thought, for gratitude, even for laughter. One afternoon, as I was tending the wilted garden, John stopped by unexpectedly. He watched me for a while before saying, "You look different." "Older?" I joked. He smiled. "No, lighter." I wiped my hands on my jeans and looked around at the quiet yard, at the sunlight settling on the fence. "Maybe I just finally know what to carry and what to put down," I said. He nodded. That's the closest thing to peace I've ever seen. After he left, I stood by the small sapling I'd planted weeks earlier, the one that had barely taken root. Its thin branches trembled in the wind, fragile but alive. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the humiliation, the long climb back toward my own name, and I realized that survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about endurance, about waiting long enough for the world to remember that you're still here. I knelt beside the sapling, pressed the soil around its base, and whispered, "Grow." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air turned cool, carrying the scent of river water and distant smoke. I went inside, closed the door behind me, and felt a strange stillness settle in the room. Not emptiness, not absence, just the quiet balance of a life finally belonging to itself again. For the first time in years, I didn't need to talk to anyone, not even Lorraine. I just sat in the fading light, breathing, grateful for the simple, stubborn fact of being. And somewhere, far down the road, I hoped my son might one day understand that what he'd taken wasn't money or property, but time, and that in the end, I'd taken it back.